Hello and welcome to interest.co.nz. I'm Gareth Vaughan with another of our double shot interviews. I'm joined by Will Fitzgibbon, who's a senior reporter at the International Consortium of Investigative Journalists. Thanks for coming in, Will.
Thanks for having me.
Will is in town to speak at an anti-money laundering conference, and just thought this would be a great opportunity to grab you to have a chat about what you've been doing at the ICIJ and where New Zealand fits into it all, because obviously you've had some investigations in recent years that have had enormous international impact. Obviously, Panama Papers, Paradise Papers would be the two main ones, but several others as well that have been done. So I guess if I could just kick off by asking you, obviously, New Zealand has appeared in these investigations about the world of offshore finance. To what extent? You're based in the US. You're originally from Australia, so you know this part of the world to some degree. To what extent has it surprised you seeing the extent to which New Zealand has popped up?
Well, it's good to be here. I think I can speak for myself, but also for many of the hundreds of reporters who worked on the Panama Papers and the Paradise Papers, and that New Zealand kind of came out of nowhere. Because you said New Zealand was, linked to or involved in the Panama Papers and Paradise Papers. In actual fact, it was a whole lot more than just simply linked. We saw, especially in the Panama Papers, but also in the Paradise Papers, very clear, intentional, and excited use of New Zealand as a clean tax haven, and that's basically where New Zealand fits in. It's the kind of one of the dark horses in this dubious financial universe of tax havens, precisely because it doesn't have the same reputational baggage that a place like Panama does, for example. So when we as journalists started seeing curious emails from businessmen in Venezuela or from lawyers for Russian tycoons writing to and corresponding with accountants and lawyers and financial service companies in Auckland, Wellington, or anywhere else, it took us by surprise, and it only made us want to dig further.
And the extent of what you did find about New Zealand, it was pretty substantial. Obviously, there were the reporting that came out of the Panama Papers, for example. New Zealand trusts and corporate structures were used by politicians in Malta. There was Brazilian corruption links, various other countries around the world. Do you think, has this changed the image of New Zealand?
I can't speak for New Zealanders, but I can certainly say that it's changed the image of New Zealand. I think for reporters who work on the offshore industry, but also more broadly issues of corruption, bribery, and tax evasion, I think in the average person, an average journalist's mind, maybe before 2016 when the Panama Papers broke, granted, there are some very good people who've covered this for a while, but speaking personally, at least, New Zealand wouldn't have been on my list for a place to look if I was interested in following some dirty Russian money, for example. And I think now that has completely changed. I think the New Zealand example was so unexpectedly perfect in how a country with a clean reputation, who no one thought of beyond the Hobbit and the All Blacks, could find itself right in the middle of corruption scandals at the heart of Europe and Latin America, that now we'd be foolish as journalists not to think about New Zealand the next time we stumble across some kind of financial scandal.
And why should we in New Zealand, and I guess our politicians in particular who have the power to make changes, why should we be concerned about this?
Hard to know where to start with that answer. I think what the Panama Papers and the Paradise Papers showed was that countries and people cannot sit on rest on their laurels and say, we think we're good people, we think we've got a clean system, that's the end of the story. I think these kind of revelations just show the importance of investigative journalism and deep reflection on what's actually going on. Because ultimately, New Zealand is being harmed reputationally as a country when this kind of business does happen. What we see is that you've got New Zealanders themselves who are potentially evading but almost certainly avoiding taxes by setting up and using these offshore structures. But also each time a corrupt politician in Europe, in Latin America and Asia takes money out of his or her country and sends it through the convoluted offshore system, including a trust or a company in New Zealand, each time a company avoids tax through these offshore structures, this money is going somewhere else and not being used in that country where it was generated. And that, I think, is what has motivated so many of us as journalists who've reported now on the offshore system for so long, which is this is not a victimless game. This is not a victimless sport in which if you're wealthy, if you can hire a lawyer, if you can hire an accountant, you're just innocently moving money around the world. I think that's the reason why I've seen such strong reactions to things like the Panama Papers and Paradise Papers, is that society is increasingly realising, as I said before, that this is not some kind of victimless offshore shell game.
Do you have any examples of countries that you've written about, maybe similar to New Zealand? I mean, a country regarded as a first world country that's had some issues like this that's really been able to clean it up successfully? Is there anyone like that? Because obviously in New Zealand, since the Panama Papers came out, our governments have made an effort. They've tightened up rules around our foreign trusts. They're now looking at improving beneficial ownership for companies. But New Zealand, according to the World Bank, is the easiest place in the world to start a business, which is great if you're legitimate. But obviously, if you want to set up a business for dubious or criminal means, it's great too. So is there anyone who's really got this right that you can think of?
We've certainly seen lots of countries, certainly after the Panama Papers, but this has been a constant evolution for a good 10, 15 years or more now. We've seen lots of countries tweak their laws, make improvements around the edges. Things like in the United Kingdom, for example, after Panama Papers, new legislation was introduced that increased penalties on what we refer to as the facilitators or the enablers in this offshore system. If a lawyer or an accountant knowingly or sometimes even unknowingly assists someone to commit a crime, evade taxes, they should be now held more accountable financially or penalty-wise than previously. I think maybe the biggest steps we've seen have probably been taken in some of those countries traditionally seen as tax havens. So a place like Panama, that for years was dragging its heels after the Panama Papers, came to the table and signed up to a raft of new international rules and regulations that required it to clean up its act. And you hear this a lot from lawyers and others working in offshore tax havens, and I think there is some truth to it, and it's an important point. They make the claim that a place like Panama or the British Virgin Islands now in some ways can be considered a lot cleaner than non-tax haven jurisdictions like the City of London, like Canada, for example, like the United States. And if my reporting and research on this issue has taught me anything, it's that the rise of the onshore, offshore jurisdictions, that is the countries who we don't think about, that's really where the action is, I think, increasingly going to move to. So I can't think of one country that, at least in my experience, deserves A grades across the board. As an investigative journalist, I think my instinct would be to never consider that any country has attained that standard. But I do think that we'd be foolish to keep speaking of the offshore industry in terms of conceiving it as dominated by countries where there are lots of palm trees, and to start thinking more about places like New Zealand, places like Canada, Holland, Ireland, for example, all these countries that traditionally might have been further in the back of our minds.
You mentioned the enablers at the start of that answer. I'm always very interested in what they do, the lawyers, accountants. Now, what is your message to them? Because obviously the way that New Zealand's been used and New Zealand corporate structures have been used, there have been lawyers and accountants who have enabled that for clients overseas. What's your message to them?
I think my main message to them as an investigative journalist would be, don't be surprised if and when we come and ask questions again. Because based on what I've seen, based on what I continue to see, I'm not convinced that the industry of enablers, and I'm talking about the world's largest accounting firms, some of the world's biggest law firms. I'm not convinced that they recognise the extent to which a lot of their work is contested by not just journalists, but by members of the public and members of political parties and governments across the world. So I think there will certainly be more stories written about them. Just as I was coming to Auckland for this talk tomorrow, I was reading through some of the Paradise Papers documents, for example, and there was one particular email about New Zealand. I think there was a lawyer from the law firm at the heart of the Paradise Papers, Appleby, who had been to New Zealand at some point on a business trip. And in this email, he talks about the fact that, and I'm quoting loosely here, but it's generally what he said, that he reported back that there are accounting firms in New Zealand who have a heightened willingness to push the boundaries, I think was the quote in the email, of laws and of legislation, and to help their clients, reduce their tax bill or worse. And that really struck with me because it goes to show how intractable this offshore problem is. If we're not just talking about rogue operators who, once they're uncovered, can be kind of thrown in jail or have the book thrown at them pretty easily, if we're not just talking about them, but we're instead talking about some of the biggest companies in the world, accounting firms who routinely receive government contracts in Australia, in the United Kingdom, perhaps in New Zealand, then I think it's going to be a lot harder to achieve lasting change, and it just means I think, in a likely situation of seeing more of these scandals in the future.
Interesting. Have you guys got anything else bubbling away in this area that we might hear more about in coming months?
I can't understandably give away any details, but one of the great things about these leaks is one leak begets another leak. And that's a point that I always try and make, is that the Panama Papers didn't just emerge one Monday morning out of nowhere. ICIJ had worked with hundreds of journalists on previous offshore projects, Swiss leaks, for example, that involved hundreds of thousands of clients around the world using private Swiss bank accounts in some cases to break laws, even to traffic arms. Other projects. So Panama Papers was part of a wave, continued with the Paradise Papers, and yes, I'm very confident that we'll see future papers or leaks in the future, because Panama Papers, remember, was, yes, 11.5 million documents. Paradise Papers was 13.5 million documents, but they still really only represent 1, 2, 3 or 4 operators within this universe. And there are plenty of other operators. And also, this is an industry where, yes, global media revelations might turn a few people off, running to the British Virgin Islands, for example. But if you're a very wealthy person, fundamentally your interest in paying as little tax as possible remains the same. It certainly is the case if you're a global multinational like Apple or Nike. And then ultimately, criminals are going to keep doing criminal activity, and they're always going to need somewhere to move their money to, but also somewhere like New Zealand possibly that has a pure and shiny enough reputation that, at least in the short term, no one's going to ask too many questions about.
Now, this work that you've done at the ICIJ, it has had a big impact. There have been actions taken in various countries around the world in response to these revelations. I mean, for you as one of the journalists who's worked on the Panama Papers, Paradise Papers projects, what are you most proud of?
Again, I'd break it down into a few different areas, I suppose. I'm firstly very proud of what the Panama Papers and Paradise Papers and other projects like that have meant for journalism and investigative journalism. We now speak of collaborative journalism as a real model and future for our industry. Panama Papers, for example, involved nearly 400 journalists from about 80 or 90 countries working together in secret for almost 12 months. And I think the value of that is shown in the global impact that the Panama Papers had. Certainly it's very satisfying as a reporter to see that investigations are open, that criminal prosecutions start, that raids have taken place, that audits have been undertaken. And I think we are now approaching the $1 billion dollar mark, US dollars that is, in terms of money that has been recouped as a result of the Panama Papers from many, many countries around the world, including New Zealand. Inland Revenue gave us a figure a few weeks ago, around $600,000, I think, that's been recouped in New Zealand from the Panama Papers. But I'd also make the point that, and this is something I feel passionately about because I report a lot on Africa and the Middle East, changing the debate around the offshore system, I think, has been equally important. Like I said before, if you're a corrupt oil minister and you've got the ability to steal a few million or $1 billion from your country's treasury, you're going to do your darndest to find a way to do that, right? And unfortunately, I think it's fair to say there will always be an offshore system somewhere that will be willing to help. But I take great comfort and pride out of the fact that now in many, many countries around the world, be it Malawi or Peru or New Zealand or Japan, you have the taxi driver, you have the hairdresser with an increased knowledge of what the word offshore means, and more importantly than that, what that means for social equality and inequality. Because the reason that I and lots of journalists report on tax havens in the offshore industry is not because we have a deep-seated love of reading complex spreadsheets and company annual reports. That is definitely not it. It's because fundamentally all of this offshore palaver results in a system in which there are parallel universes in existence. One for the average Joe like you and me, who don't even think about calling up an offshore lawyer or accountant and ask them to set up a company in Luxembourg. And the 1 or 2% of people who do, for whom that is their go-to manoeuvre in life, they as a member of the elite have all these tools at their disposal that the rest of us don't. And I think continuing to report on that and exposing how those tools and the enablers help that happen is a motivating passion of mine.
Well, great. Look, thanks for that, Will. That's Will Fitzgibbon from the International Consortium of Investigative Journalists, and I'm Gareth Vaughan at interest.co.nz.